Chapter 9. A medical student who wants intensely to be a surgeon, has marvelous hands, and displays a high level of technical skill, but does not know how the body functions or what constitutes health can hardly be called a doctor. An aspirant to the ministry who loves to work with people and possesses a marvelous gift of speaking, but has no opinion on humanity's relationship to God or about the purpose of religion, can hardly be suited for religious ministry. And a person who has a great desire to be with young people, wants to live the life of a teacher, and possesses great technical skill, but lacks a clear purpose and direction, is hardly a teacher. These three individuals are like wind-up toys, moving along blindly without a plan or an intellectual compass. Although this image may be somewhat dramatic, there are people who prepare for professions without delving into the core meaning of what those professions are all about. Such directionless behavior can cause problems in any occupation or profession, but is particularly vexing in teaching. What kind of a teacher can someone be who lacks a view of what people are and a vision of what they can become? Who cannot clearly define right and wrong in human behavior? Who doesn't recognize what is important and what is unimportant, or cannot distinguish clear thinking from sloppy thinking? The person who would take on the responsibility for educating the young without having seriously wrestled with these questions is, to say the least, dangerous, because that individual is going against the very grain of what it means to be a teacher. In fact, it is safe to say that such a person is not a teacher, but a technician. This chapter introduces you to philosophy, one of the foundational subjects in education. Philosophy, along with history and psychology, forms the intellectual underpinning of which the practice of education rests. The study of philosophy helps teachers systematically reflect on issues that are central to education, including basic concepts as learning, teaching, being educated, knowledge, and the good life. The word philosophy is made up of two root words, love and wisdom. In its most basic sense, then, philosophy is the love of wisdom. Although not all people love wisdom in the same way or to the same degree, all humans are questioning beings, that is, seekers of answers. As children, we are preoccupied with such lofty questions as, how do I get fewer veggies and more dessert? Then we progress to such questions as, how does the teacher always know to call on me when I don't have the answers? And what do I need to do to get a decent grade in geometry? Ultimately, we may move to more fundamental levels of questioning. Who am I? What is the purpose of life? And what am I doing here? And what does it mean to be a truly good person? Until approximately 100 years ago, most people relied on religion and philosophy for answers to such fundamental questions, whereas religion is said to be present, the revealed Word of God. Philosophy represents a human attempt to sort out by reason the fundamental questions of existence. Many of the great thinkers of Western civilization, Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, René Descartes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, William James, Alfred North Whitehead, and John Dewey, Jacques Maritain, John Rawls have been philosophers, because education has always been a central human concept, a central human concern. Philosophers have thought and written a great deal about education and the questions surrounding it. 23 centuries ago in ancient Greece, Aristotle puzzled over how to educate the young. In modern times, there are opposing views about the practice of education. There is no general agreement about the young should learn, either in relation to virtue or in relation to the best life. Nor is it clear whether their education ought to be directed more towards the intellect than towards character of the soul, and it is not certain whether training should be directed at things useful in life or at those conducive to virtue or at non-essentials, and there is no agreement as to what in fact does tend towards virtue. Men do not all prize most highly the same virtue, so naturally they differ also about the proper training for it. Aristotle then went on to offer some of the most profound answers to these questions in human history. The questions about what and how the young should be educated are among society's most enduring preoccupations, although there are few, if any, universally accepted answers. That in no way reduces the importance of the question and the issues surround it. Only a few people in our society are professional philosophers who earn their daily bread by pursuing answers to the fundamental questions of life. However, all of us who wrestle with such questions as who am I and what am I doing with my life are engaged in philosophical activity. Although a distinction may be made between the few professional philosophers and the vast number of amateur philosophers, the questions we ask and the answers we glean usually have a major influence on the practical affairs of our lives and determine how we choose to spend our life force. Or at the very least, they should, for instance, whether or not a person knows it, the very practical decision of whether to become a teacher, a yoga instructor, a real estate broker, or a professional poker player has its roots in his or her philosophy of life. In developing a philosophy, we draw on many influences: our home lives, our experience in the larger world, our religious views, and our reading of literature, history, current events, and our culture. A major difference between professionals and amateurs, however, lies in the precision of their methods. Philosophy is an extremely pure and abstract science. Philosophers work with neither test tubes nor white rats, use neither telescope nor microscopes, and do not fly off to remote societies to observe the natives. The method or process of philosophers is questioning and reasoning. Their product is thought. Basically, philosophers are concerned with the meaning of things and the interpretation of those meanings. For example, they have an intense interest in the real meanings of words. Although some philosophical discussion and writing involves technical language, it generally uses plain language, the ordinary language of people. At the same time, philosophers try to be extremely clear and careful about their terms of use. They do not want their ultimate goal to become lost in a thicket of fuzzy language. Although philosophy appears to deal with simple issues in simple language, behind the philosopher's questions are raging debates about profound issues that can have far-reaching implications. For example, the question, what is a human being, leads to other questions such as, is a fetus a human? And when, if ever, can a fetus be aborted? Or questions such as, what rights do severely disabled people have? Or should humans be allowed to clone humans? Philosophy covers a large amount of intellectual turf. The terrain of philosophy is divided into several areas, including 4 that are particularly important to teachers: metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, and logic. These 4 branches of philosophy are essential to the educative process and speak directly to the work of teachers. Metaphysics involves the attempt to explain the nature of the real world or the nature of existence. It attempts to answer the questions, what is real, without relying on revealed religion, such as writings in the Bible. Most metaphysicians believe that it is not possible to address fundamental matters such as the nature of human being or of the universe simply by collecting data and formulating statistical significant generalizations. From most metaphysical perspectives, the true nature of a person cannot be captured by meaning or counting alone. That is, a person is more than the sum of his or her height and weight, IQ, and SAT scores, and other vital statistics. In probing the nature of reality, the metaphysician asks a whole array of questions. Does life have meaning? Are humans being free or totally determined? Is there a purpose to life? Is there a set of enduring principles that guide the operation of the universe? Can these principles be known? And is there such a thing as stability, or is our world ever changing? The abstract questions addressed by metaphysicians are ones that educators cannot dismiss. Ultimately, the purpose of education is to explain reality to the young. The curriculum and the way in which we teach represent our statement of what that reality is and which part of that reality we should teach. In other words, the curriculum of a school represents what the community believes is most worth knowing. Although teachers may not actually be metaphysicians, they do take a stand on metaphysical questions. If a teacher decides to teach because he or she believes the most important thing in the universe is a human mind, that career decision is driven by a metaphysical view, the importance of an individual person. The people who serve on school boards also take stands on metaphysical issues. For example, whether a particular school system makes a major investment in educating individuals with severe mental disabilities or emphasizes vocational education depends very much on someone's metaphysical decision about the nature of the person and the place of work in a person's life. Epistemology deals with questions regarding knowledge and knowing. Epistemologists seek the true nature of knowing, ask questions as what is true knowledge, and is truth elusive, always changing, and always dependent on the truth seekers, particulars of time, place, and angle of vision. Some people, who we call skeptics, question our capacity to ever really know the truth of existence. Others, whom we call agnostics, are convinced that truth is unknowledgeable and that seeking knowledge of ultimate realities is a wasted effort and an empty hope. Epistemology deals not only with the nature of truth, but also with the ways in which we can know reality. Questions such as how do we come to know the truth, and what are the sources of gaining knowledge, are part of the conversation. We can know reality by a variety of ways, each of which has its advocates and detractors. Among the ways of knowing are by divine relation, by authority through personal intuition from our own five senses, from our own powers of reasoning, and through trial and error experimentation. Questions concerning knowledge and knowing are almost by definition of great concern to teachers. The epistemological question, how do you know that, goes to the heart of teaching methodology. If a teacher wants her students to have a concept of democracy, how does she proceed? Does she explain the characteristics of different forms of government, such as monarchy and oligarchy, and the characteristics of democracy, or does she take a more hands-on approach and have the students do a role-playing exercise during which one student is appointed class dictator and the rest must obey the student dictator's orders? The student who has only read about democracy knows it is an epistemological different way than a student who has been bullied and harassed for several days by a teacher-appointed dictator. Individuals clearly differ in their preferred methods of learning, as discussed more fully in Chapter 3. Who are today's students in a diverse society? Much of the teacher's work focuses on helping students find the most effective way of gaining new knowledge. This important breakthrough work on students' learning styles grew essentially out of a philosophical quest, an epistemological question: how do we know things? Some people, for example, parents and community members, may have strong opinions regarding these epistemological questions. For instance, many people hold strong beliefs about what the true origin of humankind is and how one knows it. This issue, which is sometimes called the creationist controversy, reflects a sharp and fundamental argument over the questions: who are we and how did we get here? One faction insists that the public schools should present the evidence of humans' origin that is given in the book of Genesis, which we know by divine relation. Others insist that the way to know the origin of human race is through the scientific theory of evolution, grounded in the interpretation of artifactual evidence. As you see, behind this ongoing educational controversy is a fundamental question of epistemology. Axiology focuses on the nature of what we value and how we value it. As human beings, we naturally search for the correct and most effective way to live. In doing so, we inevitably encounter questions of values. Of course, when different people look at life, they often come up with very different sets of values. For instance, hedonists believe in seeking pleasure and living for the moment. By contrast, Stoics have an austere way of looking at life and seeking to be unaffected by pleasure or pain. Many people regard values from a religious perspective, asserting that unless God originally created humanity and the rest of the natural world, existence as we know it is just the meaningless coming together of cosmic dust and debris. According to this view, the only genuine values derive from God. Most people would agree with Socrates that schools have a dual responsibility: to make people smart and to make them good. To the degree that teachers accept the second function, that is, to assist their students to become good people, they are grappling with an axiological issue. In fact, teachers are intimately involved with questions of moral values. Young people are seeking ways to live lives that are worthwhile, and teachers traditionally have been expected to help students establish moral values, both as individuals and as contributing members of society. Moral values such as honesty, respect for other people, and fairness are necessary if we are to live together in harmony. Although a majority of people agree on a substantial core of values such as respecting others and avoiding violence and settling disputes, other value-related issues separate people. For example, certain sexual practices, capital punishment, gun control, and abortion are all contemporary social issues that evoke a wide range of viewpoints about the right or correct way for people to behave. Axiology has two subtopics: ethics and aesthetics. Ethics takes us into the realm of values that relate to good and bad behavior, examining morality and rules of conduct. At one time, teaching children how to deal with issues of good and bad, right and wrong, was the primary purpose of schooling. In recent decades, the pendulum has swung the other way, and schools have become more concerned with transmitting factual and scientifically verifiable knowledge and skills than with instilling ethical knowledge in students. More recently, signs indicate that schools are being called back to their earlier mission of helping children deal with ethical issues. The subject of ethics not only teaches us how we can intellectually assert the right thing to do, but also is often used to help us establish a particular set of standards, such as a code of ethics. Chapter 8, What are the ethical and legal issues facing teachers, devotes particular attention to the issue of how to develop your own code of ethics. The second subtopic of axiology, aesthetics, deals with questions of values regarding beauty and art. Many discussions about the value of a particular film, book, or work of art are attempts to reach some aesthetic judgment on the value of the work. Whether a person has good taste is an example of a common aesthetic judgment. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates was condemned to death for supposedly corrupting the youth of Athens. Today we know him primarily through the written dialogues of his student Plato. How much Plato's portrayal resembled the actual man is open to debate. Nevertheless, the Socrates of Plato's dialogues has had a deep and lasting influence on both philosophy and education, as the source of terms such as Socratic teaching, Socratic questioning, and the Socratic method. The following paragraphs explain some of the basic tenets of Socrates' approach. Socrates expressly denied that he was a teacher in the commonly accepted sense of that term. What he meant by this, at least in part, was that he was not a sophist, a professional pedagogue who, for a fee, would endeavor to transmit some knowledge that he possessed to someone who lacked it. Not only did Socrates charge no fees, he claimed not to have command of any such knowledge. The learning that Socrates was concerned with simply didn't fit the information transmission model of education implicit in the Athenian public mind and the teaching profession. Neither did his pioneering focus on virtue and wisdom square well with the popular attachment to honor, fame, and wealth. As he tried to explain at one point to Anytus in Plato's dialogue Meno, we are inquiring whether the good men of today and of the past knew how to pass on to another the virtue that they themselves possessed, or whether a man cannot pass it on or receive it from another, because it was clear that wisdom and virtue could not simply be passed on from one person to another. Socrates sought an alternative way of conceptualizing how such excellences of mind and character were acquired. What was the teacher's role in this acquisition, if not simply being a supplier? As an alternative to the receiving knowledge from another model, Socrates proposed that learning was recollection, that is, a process akin to dredging up knowledge from one's own resources. Teaching on this model, he later compared to acting as a midwife, assisting in the birth of knowledge in another person rather than serving as a supplier of it to another person. This was to be accomplished in conversation mostly by skillful questioning and cross-examination. Socrates admitted to behaving like a gadfly in this dialectical pursuit of truth, goading people into serious thinking about human living, and he also confessed to acting like a benumbing stingray or torpedo fish, referring to his ability to render people tongue-tied about matters that they thought they already knew perfectly well, but actually didn't. Not until people felt the sting of not really knowing about life's important matters could they be prompted to inquire into them seriously. Logic is the branch of philosophy that deals with reasoning. One of the fundamental qualities that distinguishes human beings from animals is that humans can think. The pursuit of logic is an attempt to think clearly and avoid vagueness and contradiction. Certain rules of logic have been identified, and they constitute the core of this branch of philosophy. Logic focuses on reasoning and modes of arguing that bring us to valid conclusions. A primary task of the school is to help children think clearly and communicate logically. Two types of reasoning are commonly taught in schools, deductive and inductive. In deductive reasoning, teachers present a general proposition and then illustrate it with a series of particulars. The most highly developed form of this approach is the classic method of the syllogism. In a syllogism, one makes two statements and then a third statement, a conclusion, is deducted or drawn from them. For instance, all human beings are mortal. I am a human being, therefore I am mortal. In this kind of deductive reasoning, the general proposition, an abstract concept, is followed by a factual statement, which in turn lead to a new factual statement and the creation of knowledge, at least for the learners. As another example, imagine that in October, Miss Wells, the 5th grade teacher, writes the following statement on the board. All trees that shed their leaves are at the end of a growing season are deciduous trees. As a 2-week project, Mrs. Wells asked her class to observe and record data about the trees that surround their school. For 2 weeks, the students observed the 3 dozen maple trees shedding their leaves during the fall. The teacher then writes her earlier sentence on the board again. All trees that shed their leaves at the end of a growing season are deciduous trees. Using their observational data, the students complete the syllogism. Maple trees shed their leaves at the end of the growing season. Therefore, maple trees are deciduous. Then the students try to identify other types of trees that fit the deciduous classification. Much of which teachers do in school focuses on helping children both acquire the intellectual habits of deductive thinking and expand their storehouse of knowledge through this process. Inductive reasoning works in the opposite fashion. With this type of reasoning, teachers set forth particulars from which a general proposition is derived or induced. For instance, a teacher may wish to lead students to the discovery that water is essential to plant growth. He gives each child 2 similar plants and then has each student daily feed one plant with water and leave the other plant without water. After 10 days, the teacher has the students report on the conditions of their plants. From all of these individual reports, he leads the students to generalize about the necessity of water to plant life. In fact, they have induced their answer. Although the deductive and inductive forms of reasoning are opposite, both are essential to logical thought and therefore need to be developed in learners. Effective teachers design a variety of learning activities, some of which help students think deductively and others that focus on inductive reasoning. Logic is not confined to inductive and deductive reasoning. To think logically means to think clearly in many different ways. Teachers need logic in many aspects of their work, from trying to understand the behavior of a child who seems to have an erratic learning pattern to developing tests that accurately measure what has been taught in a course. Most of all, teachers need to model this clear logical thinking for students. Overall, the 4 branches of philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, and logic address some of the major concerns of teachers. We now consider the answers they suggest to teachers and the implications they have for actual classroom practice. Now that you know the philosophical lay of the land, and before we explore the dominant philosophies of education that exist in our schools, it is time to pause and reflect. What are your deepest beliefs and attitudes about teaching students, and what should be learned? This short inventory allows you to bring your current philosophy of education to the surface. We say current philosophy of education because the philosophies of many educators go through change, and sometimes quite dramatic change, as a result of study, classroom experience, or both. Answers to the philosophical statements in the self-inventory and questions that pepper the preceding section have almost infinite variety. Over the years, however, certain answers by particular philosophers have received more attention and allegiance than others. These more enduring sets of answers or worldviews represent schools of philosophy. Some started with the early Greek philosophers and have grown and evolved through the centuries. Other schools of thought are more recent developments and offer fresh new formulations to ultimate questions. In this section, we describe 4 philosophies that have had a major influence on American education and demonstrate the variety of ways in which teaching and learning can be conceived. Be aware that many important philosophies relevant to education are not included here. Among them are neo-Thomisms, existentialisms, and classical Eastern thought such as Zen Buddhism and Confucianism. In addition, some major educational ideas do not quite qualify as philosophies, but are nevertheless having a major impact on schools. The four philosophies discussed at length in this chapter are perennialism, essentialism, romanticism, and progressivism. Behind these rather daunting words are very different ideas of what people are, how we should live our lives, and how we should conduct the education of children. We elected to cover these philosophies not because they are the top four philosophical hits, but because each viewpoint has exerted a major influence on American education, thought, and practice. We have grouped these philosophies based on whether they have subject-centered or child-centered. For each philosophy, we present first a brief explanation of its origins and the core ideas it embodies, followed by its implications for teaching and learning, and then a personal point of view by a teacher who is committed to that particular philosophy. These positions are not just windy abstractions or the preoccupations of ivory tower thinkers, rather they have practical implications for learning, shaping what people teach and how they teach it. The first two schools of philosophy, perennialism and essentialism, stress the importance of subject matter knowledge in education. Both schools of thought show a strong allegiance to the curriculum, and both argue that well-educated students should possess a defined body of knowledge. Also, both often get a bump rap being labeled as teacher-centered. The label teacher-centered conjures up images of an authoritarian teacher turning himself or herself into the center of attention, making all the decisions and attempts to control everything that goes on in a classroom. Clearly, authoritarianism and ego-tripping can hide behind each of the four philosophies we will explore. Although they are convinced of the importance of certain knowledge, subject-centered teachers can be passionately committed to student learning. Perennialism, which is derived primarily from the writings of Plato, views truth and nature, in particular human nature, as constant, objective, and unchanging. Beneath the superficial differences from one century or decade to the next, the rules that govern the world and the characteristics that make up human nature stay the same. The purpose of life, according to Plato, is the search for these constant and changeless truths, which reside in the nature of things. This search is achieved through the Socratic dialogue or dialect, a process in which ideas are debated in a back-and-forth discussion until some recognizable charity is reached. Essential to undertaking such a pursuit is mental discipline and rational thought processes. Perennialists view education as crucial because it develops a person's mental discipline and rationality, which are necessary to search for truths that will help humans avoid being dominated by the instructional side of human nature. For perennialists, the purpose of education is to find changeless truth, which is best revealed in the enduring classics of Western culture. According to this perspective, schools should emphasize classical thought as their subject matter. Perennialists believe that schools should teach disciplined knowledge through the traditional subjects of history, language, mathematics, and science, and the arts. They place particular emphasis on literature and the humanities, believing that these subjects provide the greatest insight into the human condition. Although this view of the curriculum is evident in many areas of education, in its most complete form, it is known as the Great Books approach, as developed by Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was president and chancellor at the University of Chicago throughout the 1930s and 40s, and the late Mortimer Adler, a professor at the University of Chicago, during the same time period. The Great Books, which constitute a shelf of volumes stretching from Homer's Iliad to Albert Einstein's On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, are perennialist ideal curriculum. In perennialist-oriented high school curricula, a broader and more modern selection of works is included, though the emphasis remains on the intellectual richness of the material. For perennialists, in the early years of schooling, the development of the intellect is best achieved through a teacher-directed instructional approach that develops the fundamental skills needed for later learning. Socratic dialogue is then used to help mature learners question and examine their beliefs, enabling them to move closer to the truth. Since the early 90s, a controversy has arisen over the content of perennialist literature, history, and philosophy courses. Scholars and students have criticized colleges and high schools for promoting a Eurocentric view of knowledge and culture, one that ignores the contributions of everyone except dead white male writers and thinkers. They urge adoption of a more inclusive curriculum, that is, one that gives greater attention to women, minorities, and members of African, Asian, Hispanic, and Islamic cultures. Although some perceive this movement to be a direct attack on the perennialist curriculum, others see it as a natural and useful extension of the perennialist search for the best in the world's wisdom. One perennialist friend of ours who welcomes this new approach suggested, sure, students should know about Islamic literature and Eastern philosophy, but they should first get to know their own neighborhood, Western culture. Education is of great importance to perennialists, but is an education that is rigorous and demanding. Perennialists insist that education is preparation for life and therefore believe that it should not attempt to imitate life or be lifelike. Students should engage in a rigorous examination of the classics, mostly ancient but some modern, to discover the timeless wisdom embodied in this literature rather than focusing on knowledge that might seem personally meaningful. In summary, the perennialist view is that though disciplined study of the great works, a person acquires reasoning skills and mastery of the important ideas of human history. This view leans heavily on the authority of the collected wisdom of the past and looks to traditional thought to guide us in the present. As such, the curriculum is structured and clearly defined. Perennialists also see education as protecting and conserving the best thought from the past. In this sense, they favor a very traditional or conservative view of education. The following case study presents the point of view of a more or less typical perennialist teacher. I came into education 25 years ago for two reasons. First, I was bothered by what I thought was all the nonsense in the curriculum, and by all the time my friends and I wasted in school. We were allowed to take whatever courses we wanted, the majority of which were electives that seemed to be little more than the teacher's hobby. There were so many discussions that seemed to go nowhere and seemed only vaguely to touch on the supposed content of the course. I often felt as if we were simply sharing our ignorance. My second reason for becoming a teacher is a more positive one. I am convinced that our society, our culture, has great ideas that have been behind our progress in the last 2,500 years. We need to share these ideas, to vigorously teach these ideas to the young. Essentially, I see my job as passing on to the next generation as effectively and forcefully as I can the important truths, for instance, about human dignity and the capacity of people to do both good and evil. That has always been the teacher's role until recent times. When we seem to have lost our way, I am convinced that a society that doesn't make the great ideas and the great thoughts the foundation of education is bound to fail. Nations and societies do falter and fall. The last 50 years have seen several formerly prominent nations slip to the wayside, while our younger, more vigorous countries like Singapore and South Korea, and most recently China, have risen. I am convinced that most of those failed countries fell because of the inadequate education they provided. I am dedicated to the goal of not letting that happen here. I think students are just great. In fact, I've given my life to working with them. But I don't think it is fair to them or to me or to our country to allow them to set the rules to decide what they want to learn or to tell me how to teach it. Sure, I listen to them and try and find out where they are, but I make the decisions. My job is to teach, theirs is to learn. And in my classroom, those functions are quite clear. Really, students are too young to know what are the important things to learn. They simply don't know what they need to know. As a teacher, as a representative of the larger culture and of society, that's my responsibility. Turning that responsibility over to students or giving them a huge say in what is taught just strikes me as silly. Worse, it's wrong. I also believe that students should be pushed. School should be very demanding because life is very demanding. I'm not worried about students' so-called self-esteem. Self-esteem is empty unless it is earned. It will come when students discipline themselves. All of us are lazy when we are young. We would much rather play than work. All of this trying to make school like play is just making it more difficult for students to acquire the self-discipline needed to take control of their lives. What schools are turning out right now, and it pains me to say this, are a lot of self-important, self-indulgent kids. And it's not their fault. It's our fault as teachers and parents. And the answer is so simple. We just need to go back to the great ideas and achievements of the past and make them the focal point of education. When we achieve this goal, the students don't mind working. The students and the other teachers kid me about being a slave driver. I don't really pay attention to that, but I do pay attention to the large number of students, both college-bound and non-college-bound, who come back 2 or 3 years out of high school and tell me how much they value having been pushed, how glad they are that I put them in contact with the very best. Essentialism is a uniquely American philosophy of education that began in the 1930s and 40s as a reaction to what was seen as an overemphasis on a child-centered approach to education and a concern that students were not gaining appropriate and adequate knowledge in schools. Essentialism has its philosophical origins in two older philosophies and draws something from each. From Plato's idealism, it takes the view of the mind as this something from each. From Plato's, the central tool for understanding an objective and unchanging reality, as well as for learning those essential ideas and knowledge that what we need to live well. From Aristotle's realism, it takes the tent that the mind learns through contact with the physical world. According to this view, to know reality, we must learn to observe and measure the physical world accurately. From our observations, we use our reasoning ability to gain new knowledge. This contrasts with the perennialist view that reasoning alone can lead to truth. Essentialists believe that there exists a critical core of information and skills that an educated person must have. They are convinced that the overwhelming number of children can and should learn this body of essential material, whether or not they embrace the label essentialist. Educators and others currently supporting the adoption of a nationwide core curriculum are promoting educational essentialism. According to this view, schools should be organized to transmit this knowledge and skill as effectively as possible. For essentialists, the methods used to transmit this knowledge and skill are not specifically prescribed. The focus is instead on the knowledge that students gain. In many ways, essentialism sounds a good deal like perennialism. Although these two views have much in common, some important differences exist between them. For example, essentialists do not focus as intently on truths as do perennialists. They are less concerned with the classics as being the primary repository of worthwhile knowledge. Instead, essentialists search for what will help a person live a productive life today. In the current economic reality, strongly suggests that students need to graduate from high school with computer literacy, for example. Essentialists will find a place for this training in the curriculum. In this regard, essentialists are very practical. Like perennials, essentialists look upon the many elective courses in our high schools as frills, distracting students from the core knowledge they will later need. At the same time, whereas perennialists will hold fast to the great books as the storehouse of critical knowledge, essentialists will make more room for scientific, technical, and even vocational emphasis in the curriculum. Essentialists see themselves as valuing the past but not being captured by it. The core knowledge program is a curriculum which, not to be confused with, is a curriculum which that sets out in detail what students from kindergarten to 8th grade should know. The educational philosophy behind it is probably best categorized as essentialist. Based on the book Cultural Literacy by E.D. Hurch Jr., this content-rich curriculum stresses academics and learning of specific knowledge. Although it emphasizes on important ideas and great works of the past, makes it attractive to perennialists, the curriculum's focus on current literature and emphasis on science point more to its alignment with the essentialist movement. During 2012-2013 school year, there were 1,230 schools in 45 states in the District of Columbia using all or part of the core knowledge sequence. For essentialists, the aim of education is to teach youth the essentials they need to live well in the modern world. To realize this goal, students should focus on the established disciplines, which are the containers of organized knowledge. As captured in the educational slogan, Back to the Basics, the elementary years should concentrate on the basics such as the 3 R's. These and other foundational tools are needed to gain access to disciplined knowledge with which one means to come in contact in high school. Although some debate persists about what is essential in the curriculum, essentialists believe this is not a debate to which children can contribute fruitfully. Instead, they see the role of students as simply that of learners. Thus, an individual child's interests, motivations, and psychological states are not given great attention in deciding what is to be taught, nor do essentialists advocate a romantic view of children as being naturally good. They see the students not as evil, but rather as deficient and needing discipline and pressure to keep learning. School is viewed as a place where children come to learn what they need to know. Teachers are not guides but authorities. The student's job is to listen and learn. Given the imperfect state of the students, teachers must be ingenious in finding ways to engage their imaginations and minds. One notable essentialist was James Bryan Conant, a Harvard professor and president for much of the first half of the 20th century. Concerned about disparities in the knowledge and skills that high school students had brought with them to college, Conant argued for standardization of college requirements for high school students. He was also influential in the establishment of the SAT as a measure of essential knowledge that a potential college student needs to possess. Although not purely an essentialist movement, much of the thought and energy behind the drive for the state standards, standardized testing, the No Child Left Behind Act, the race to the top, and the Common Core has a strong essentialist flavor. The case study immediately above offers a perspective of a representative essentialist teacher. In my view, the world is filled with real problems, and the young people who leave school have to be ready to take up the challenge of life and solve these problems. For me, the watchword in education is usefulness. I think everything that is taught has to pass the test of whether it is useful. My job as a teacher is to find out what is useful and then to make sure the students learn it. I believe that schools should be relevant to the young. However, my view of what is relevant is very different from the views of lots of other people. For me, relevance is not what is personally meaningful or a do-your-own-thing approach. What is relevant is what helps the individual live well and what benefits humanity. For that, we need to look very carefully at the past and sort out the most valuable learning. That is what should be taught and what should be learned. I find the back to the classic approach quite valuable. However, most advocates go too far in concentrating on classics. They also stress the humanities and the arts a little too much and tend to underplay science and technology. If children are going to function in today's world, and if our world is going to solve all the problems it's confronted with, we have to give more attention to science and technology than we have in the past. But clearly the past is the place to begin our search for the relevant curriculum. It's not the most pleasing or satisfying image, but I think the concept of the student as an empty jug is the most accurate one. Certainly, kids come to school with lots of knowledge and lots of interests. However, the job of school is to teach them what they don't know and to teach these things in a systemic and organized way. It's not to fill their minds with isolated fragments and information, but to fill them with systemic knowledge. They need tools to learn, and as they get older, they need human insights and skills that come from the disciplines. Given that there is so much to learn, an emphasis on student interest in projects and problem solving is quite wasteful. There is plenty of time for that outside of school and when school is over. Inside the school, the teachers are the authorities and the students are there to learn what they don't know. The environment should be task-oriented and disciplined. It does not have to be oppressive or unjust or any of that. I tell my students that learning is not necessarily going to be fun, but that at the end of the year they will have a great sense of accomplishment. I take accomplishment over fun anytime. By and large, most students do too. In contrast to perennialism and essentialism, the next two schools of philosophy, romanticism and progressivism, look first to the learners rather than to the curriculum. Both consider the development of learners to be the main purpose of education. A well-educated person does not necessarily have a definite body of knowledge. Rather, a well-educated person is able to function well in society and life. Romanticism, also known as naturalism, is based on the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an 18th century Swiss French philosopher, in a condemnation of society and the educational system of the time. Rousseau wrote Emile, a novel that details Rousseau's ideas about the education through the example of a fictional young boy, Emile. Rousseau believed that children are born good and pure. Once exposed to the evils of society, however, they become corrupted. To keep children good, they need to be isolated from society for as long as possible. Rousseau describes a serene yet well-controlled bucolic environment for the ideal education of Emile. He is to be educated by a private tutor at the country manor where he lives. Emile's education begins with his exploration of the world of nature surrounding him. From his observations, he may ask questions about the natural world that the tutor answers. There are no formal lessons, no books to read or facts to memorize, no specific curriculum to learn. Emile decides what he learns about and when. As Emile matures, the tutor helps him develop rational thinking skills but Emil continues to decide the topics of study. When Emil is around 15, he is slowly introduced to certain social situations until he is deemed ready by his tutor to resist the evils of society and live a productive life in the societal world. By the time he is 20, Emil is ready to take a mate and make a life for himself. Unlike the perennialists and essentialists who highlight the importance of educating the individual for society, the Romantics consider the needs of the individual more important than the needs of society. For the Romantics, the purpose of education is individual self-fulfillment. That is, education must help the students develop physically, intellectually, socially, and morally. Although clearly an unrealistic model for tax-supported education, the ideas embedded in Rasool's Emil have had a strong impact on the thinking of many educators. Romantics believe that education is a natural process which grows out of children's innate curiosity. This curiosity is most obvious during the why phase of young childhood, when nearly every utterance out of the child's mouth is another question. Why is that dog barking? Why is the boy sad? Or why is the bird blue? Romantics argue that we must let children's interest and curiosity drive their learning. The teacher's job is to respond to the children's questions as they arise, and not to impose the learning of subjects that are not of interest to the child. The learner's responsibility is to maintain their natural curiosity and desire to learn. Because they perceive learning to be guided by student interest, Romantics do not advocate the establishment of a set common curriculum of study. Some students may be interested in kayaking, where others want to study photography, and still others may be fascinated by how an iPad can do all it can do. As students pursue their own ideas of study, their approach to teaching and learning likewise becomes individualized. Much of the learning is self-directed and self-guided by the students, with teachers serving as sources of information or researches to help students satisfy their curiosity rather than functioning as task makers or authorities on knowledge. Romanticism has been especially influential in the early childhood and elementary grades. Many early childhood educators, including such pioneers as Maria Montessori, Frederick Forbull, John Pestalozzi, basically agree with Rasool's ideas about humans' innate curiosity and using a child's interest to define the curriculum. Although none proposed as radical a school setting as Rasool's pastoral manner, they did adopt some of Rasool's other ideas about education, such as providing young children with extensive opportunities to manipulate real things, such as wooden blocks, clay, and other materials. The purpose is to establish learning environments that provoke students' curiosity. Today, schools such as Summerhill School in Suffolk, England, and the Sudbury Valley School in Framingham, Massachusetts, embody many of the beliefs of the Romantics. At these schools, there are no set curriculum, no formal classes, and no tests. Students decide what they want to study, and in some cases are expected to take responsibility for their learning. The following case study represents the views of a Romantic teacher. Have you ever seen the thrill on a young child's face when he or she figures out how to make something work? What about their wonder as they ask another question about why there are rainbows or thunder and lightning? I see these young children, and then I look at some of the students in school today. Their faces are filled with so much dread or disinterest or boredom that I get disheartened. What happened to enthusiasm, that excitement for learning? I wonder that schools, which should be places of learning, can turn students off to learning so strongly is the reason I became a teacher. I want my classroom to be a place where students can explore their interests and satisfy their curiosities. I cannot make them learn information if it's not something that they're interested in. In my classroom, students decide what they want to study, and I help them find the resources. Sometimes we get books from the library or find websites on the internet. The internet has been a wonderful resource for my students. Some of them have been able to have online conversations with professionals in fields like aerospace engineering and bioengineering. Sometimes I set up face-to-face meetings with professionals in a particular field. Last week, we had a computer programmer in to talk to a couple of students who were interested in learning more about writing code. It's so exciting to see students enthusiastic about what they're learning. What I call the test Nazis really have trouble with my approach. Their view is that students have big holes in their knowledge. They don't learn the hard stuff. They cannot pass standardized tests. My students may not do very well in standardized tests, but they do learn the hard stuff. I mean, computer programming, aerospace engineering, and bioengineering. These are not easy topics to understand. It may be that my students don't know a lot of facts in the standardized subjects, but they know well what they learn because they have selected these topics themselves. They want to learn about them, so they do. Progressivism is a relatively young philosophy of education. It came to prominence in the 1920s, growing out of the progressive political and social movement of the time. This school of thought drew from some of the ideas of Rawls and from the work of John Dewey, the most influential educational philosopher of the 20th century. Progressivism views nature as being in flux, as ever-changing. Consequently, knowledge must continually be redefined and rediscovered to keep with that change, whereas other philosophies see the mind as a jug to be filled with truth or as a muscle that needs to be exercised and conditioned. Progressives view the mind as a marvelous mechanism for problem solving. Like the Romantics, advocates of the progressive viewpoint believe that people are naturally exploring, inquiring entities. When faced with an obstacle, they will try to find a way to overcome it. When faced with a question, they will try to find an answer. For progressives, education aims to develop this problem-solving ability. Progressive educators believe that the place to begin in education is with the student rather than with the subject matter. When following this philosophy, teachers identify with what each student's interests and concerns are and try to shape problems around them. Teachers then help the students develop strategies to solve the problems posed. Students' motivation to solve problems is the key to this educational model, and posing problems based on students' interest helps heighten their motivation. Students should start with simple study projects and gradually learn more systemic ways to investigate until they finally master a variety of problem-solving strategies. Rather than being presenters of knowledge or task makers, teachers are intellectual guides, facilitators in the problem-solving process. Students are encouraged to be imaginative and resourceful in solving problems. They are directed to a variety of learning methods, from reading books and studying the traditional disciplines to performing experiments and analyzing data. Method is of great importance to advocates of this progressive philosophy. Conversely, formal traditional knowledge, is not given the same honored place. For progressives, there is really no special sacrosanct knowledge or subject matter that all students must learn. Instead, the value of knowledge is seen as residing only in its ability to solve human problems. Regarding the school curriculum, progressives believes that students can learn problem-solving skills from electronics just as easily from Latin, from agronomy just as well as from geometry. The focus for progressive educators is teaching students how to think rather than what to think. The slogan teacher as guide on the side rather than sage on the stage captures the uniqueness of the progressive view and its special instructional process. Progressive teachers often introduce traditional subject matter, but they use it differently from the way it is used in a traditional classroom, because the problems students are trying to solve are paramount importance. The subjects continue primarily through providing context for problems students must solve. Of course, subject matter knowledge may also provide information that leads to solutions. With the progressive viewpoint, the process, not the product, is used as the critical concern. Although both romantic and progressive educators start with students' interests, progressives have more structure behind their teaching. They also have goals for their students, as discussed next. John Dewey, the founder of instructionalism, is widely considered the single most influential figure in the history of American educational thought. At the same time, his ideas and beliefs have been frequently misunderstood and misinterpreted, leading to the misapplication of his theories. Dewey grew up in Vermont, where he attended public schools and the University of Vermont. As a graduate student in philosophy at Johns Hopkins University, he was deeply influenced by the ideas of Charles S. Peirce and William James, the founder of pragmatist philosophy. Dewey recognized the implications of education of Peirce's argument that ideas or propositions have worthy only if they make a difference in future thoughts or actions, calling his own philosophy instrumentalism. to emphasize the principle that ideas are instruments. Dewey argued that philosophy and education both involve a practical experimental attempt to improve the human condition. Dewey denounced the public schools classical curriculum in the 19th century as totally unsuited to the demands of newly industrialized society of the United States. He claimed that schools were divorced from life and that they failed to teach children how to use knowledge, defining education as a continuous reconstruction of experience. Dewey said that schools should teach children not what to think, but how to think. In his 1916 treatise, Democracy and Education, he claimed that the schools offered students as future citizens no preparation for assuming the responsibility of citizenship in a democracy. Dewey called for public schools to provide a concentrated study of democratic processes and to reflect those processes in the organization of school life, going as far as advocating that students be given the power to make decisions affecting life in the school in a democratic way. He considered participation in life rather than preparation for it the hallmark of an effective education. In 1896, Dewey established the University Laboratory School, an elementary school at the University of Chicago. It was experimental in two senses: in its use of experiment and inquiry as the method by which the children learned, and in its role as a laboratory for the transformation of the schools. The activities and occupations of adult life served as the core of the curriculum and the model teaching method. Children began by studying and imitating simple domestic and industrial tasks. In later years, they studied the historical development of industry, invention, group living, and nature. Dewey wrote that we must make each one of our schools an embryonic community life, active with types of occupations that reflect the life of the larger society, and permeated with the spirit of art, history, and science. In the late 1920s to the early 1940s, the area of progressive education, a massive attempt to implement Dewey's ideas occurred, but the rigid manner in which they were interpreted led to remarkable extravagances in some progressive schools. For instance, some educators considered it useless to teach geography because maps changed so rapidly. The role of subject matter was gradually played down in progressive schools, placed by a stress on method and process. The rationale was that it was more important to produce a good citizen than a person who was educated in the classical sense. Until he was well into his 90s, Dewey fought vehemently against these corruptions of his views. The centrality of John Dewey's thought to U.S. education has waxed and waned over the years, traditionally more popular in universities than in actual classroom practice. Dewey's work is often invoked by people who are attempting to make the schools more humanistic and the curriculum more relevant to the current world. Whether in favor or out, John Dewey represents the United States' most distinctive contributor to educational thought. Unlike romantic educators who may see society as a negative influence on students, progressives see society as an integral aspect of the student's life. Progressives view schools as small societies in themselves, places where students are learning as they live life, not simply preparing for life. This gives progressive schools a unique atmosphere, different from that of perennialist storehouses of wisdom or places with the clearly defined roles and authority structures promoted by essentialists. Progressive educators believe the school should be democratic in structure so that children can learn to live well in a democracy and become good citizens. They emphasize group activity and group problem solving so that students learn to work with others and help others. This is one reason many teachers who describe themselves as progressive educators are enthusiastic about cooperative learning strategies, such as those discussed in Chapter 5, What is Taught. Implicit in the progressive approach is the belief that children must not only learn to solve their own problems, but also help to solve the problems of their neighbors. For progressives, one of the main purposes of education is to make society better, which requires that people work together to solve problems. It is not uncommon for the problem-solving activities of the progressive school to spill out into the community and involve students in issues such as ecology and poverty. In this way, students learn an important principle of progressive education. Knowledge should be used to redesign or improve the world. One notable progressive educator was William Herd Kilpatrick, who was a professor of philosophy of education at Columbia University in New York. He was a follower of many of Dewey's ideas about education, but differed on the importance of subject matter in a child's educational experience. Rejecting formal curriculum study, he developed the project method of education, in which students work in groups on a topic of interest to them. He believed that because students learn only what is of interest to them, they should be the ones to determine topics of study. Both progressive and essentialist educators claim their particular approach is a true American philosophy of education. One can make a case that both match this description, but each reflects different aspects of the American personality. Progressivism represents our anti-authoritarian, experimental, and visionary side. Essentialism speaks to our more practical, structured, and task-oriented side. In recent years, many of the tensions and public debates in the U.S. education can be traced to struggles between these two philosophies of education. Clearly, essentialist educators gained ground on progressive educators in the 1980s and 1990s. Concerns over the country's global economic competitiveness and the perceived softness of our schools have created a repetitive climate for essentialist views. To judge your own sympathy for the progressive approach, see what you think of the following representative statement by a progressive educator. I am a progressive educator, and I am proud of it. I am not ducking that label just because it is unpopular in many quarters these days. Usually among people who don't really understand what it is. Quite honestly, for the life of me, I cannot understand how a teacher can be anything but a progressive educator. I am dedicated to a few simple and I believe obvious principles. For one thing, children come into the world with a very plastic nature, capable of being molded one way or another. We should therefore work to surround them with activities and opportunities that bring them in contact with good things. Also, by their nature, children are curious. Instead of rejecting the curiosities, I believe we should build on them. Schools should be exciting and involving places where students are caught up in interesting activities. I think that I am a progressive educator because I have looked at my own experiences. I know I learn best when I am trying to solve a puzzle or a problem that really interests me. Somehow I have always been able to get much more interested in how we're going to solve the problems of our own society than in the affairs of the Athenians and Spartans. I can get much more involved in a research problem about which MP3 player gives the best value for the dollar than about some dry economic problem presented to me by a teacher. And I really don't think I'm different from the overwhelming majority of students. I see many of my fellow teachers spending all their energy damming up student curiosity and imposing work on their students, and then the teachers wonder why they themselves are so tired or burned out. I'm sure it's quite tiring to try and convert children into file cabinets and to stuff facts into their heads all day. One of the things that sets me apart is that I'm not so hung up as others are on what I call the talky curriculum. I am convinced that students learn most effectively by doing, by experiencing events and then reflecting on and making meaning out of what they have experienced. I think most science is learned on a nature walk than from the same time spent reading a textbook or hearing teacher explanations. I think students learn more abstract principles such as democracy from trying to set up and maintain a democratic society in their classroom than from a lot of learned lectures and dusty prose on this subject. I am trying to get to their hearts and their heads. Their traditional approach gives to neither place. To me, life is a matter of solving problems. New times have new problems and demand new knowledge. I don't want my students to be ready for life in the 18th century. I want them to be effective, functioning, curious citizens of the 21st century. They're going to need to be able to develop solutions to fit new and unique problems. Although much knowledge is important, they need to realize that knowledge is only today's tentative explanation of how things work. Much of what we know now is incorrect and will have to be replaced. It's not that I think that ideas and content in the traditional subject are worthless, far from it. I teach much of the same material as other teachers. I just get there by a different route. I let the issues and problems emerge and then give the students a chance to get answers and to solve problems. As they quickly learn, they have to know a great deal to solve some of the problems. Often they get themselves involved with some very advanced material. The only difference is that now they want to. Now they have the energy, and boy, once they get going, do they have the energy. No, it doesn't always work. I have students who coast, and I've had a project that failed, but I put my track record against those of my more traditional colleagues any day. Since the early 20th century, educational practices have been greatly influenced by the discipline of philosophy. Philosophy, the scientific study of the mind and human behavior, was a natural influence on the work of teachers, particularly given its focus on how we learn. Over the years, various schools of philosophy have emerged, often having roots in particular philosophies. Some of these philosophical theories have had a great deal to say to educators. Two in particular have strongly influenced our schools: behaviorism and cognitive psychology. The psychological theory of behavior modification, also known as behaviorism, is an educational approach that emerged directly from the pioneering research of B.F. Skinner, who himself was influenced by the social efficiency movement in education of the 1920s and 30s. Skinner developed the theory called apparent conditioning, which viewed learning as the learner's response to various stimuli present in one's environment, subscribing to the view that humans learn to act in specific ways based on the response they receive for their actions. Behaviorist teachers believe that learners need incentives, both positives and negatives, as motivators to learn. In planning for teaching, behaviorists use clear objectives spelled out in terms of the behaviors to be learned, establish a learning environment which will positively reinforce desired behaviors and eliminate undesirable behaviors, and closely monitor and give learners feedback on progress until the goal is achieved. The curriculum is organized in sequenced, discrete segments because the same behaviors and knowledge are desirable for all students. Standardizations of the curriculum and the means to measure progress is important. Behaviorist teachers often use objective tests made up predominantly of multiple choice questions to measure how well students have learned the curriculum and to give prompt feedback to students. In some behaviorist classrooms, students are expected to practice a specific skill until they show a certain level of mastery of the skill. At that point, they move on to the next skill or concept to be learned. In the 60s and 70s, many educators made behavioralism their dominant organizing educational theory. This educational movement has been criticized for being teacher-dominant and causing teachers to treat students as passive objectives to be conditioned and therefore manipulated. Nevertheless, behaviorism remains a dominant theoretical presence, particularly in the areas of special education and classroom discipline. The popular assertive discipline in which teachers are urged to catch students doing good and then reward that behavior is based squarely on behaviorism. Many teachers rely on behavior modification practices to get students to be quiet when they see or hear the teacher's signal, or to get them to do their best work to receive a reward sticker. Critics argue that behaviorist teachers exercise too much control over students' learning and focus on the learning of facts rather than deep conceptual knowledge. In response, behaviorist teachers insist that their goal is to eventually put control of learning in their students' hands once they have learned to respond appropriately to the teacher's prompts. Over the past 30 years, researchers in both medicine and psychology have been investigating the human brain to find out more about its role in human learning and memory. Cognitive psychologists, drawing heavily on the trailblazing research of Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget and the Russian psychologist Leigh Vygotsky and the American psychologist Jerome Bruner, have discovered a great deal about how people learn to think and solve problems. Their discoveries have led to the development of new theories about learning and cognition that have tremendous implications for how teachers teach. One increasingly popular theory derived from the research findings states that for new information to be internalized by learners, it must be integrated into the learner's pre-existing knowledge base. This process of integration is referred to as constructivism. According to this theory, knowledge cannot be transmitted directly from teachers to learners, but rather is constructed by learners and later reconstructed as new information becomes available. Instead of seeing students as partially full vessels waiting to be filled, as some essentialists do, constructivist teachers view them as actively engaged in situations where students can build their own knowledge rather than having students sit and listen to the teacher's lectures. One constructivist technique for helping students make meaning of a concept is called scaffolding, whereby a teacher provides support as students attempt to understand that concept. Although not without its critics, constructivism has become so influential in education in recent years that we give it particular attention here. Constructivists view individuals as having an aversion to disorder. They believe that we are all continually trying to sort things out, to find clues and patterns amid our impressions that will help us to make sense of the world around us. When we encounter something new, say a strange sound in the night, we immediately attempt to fit it into the patterns of structures we already possess. Don't worry, that's the midnight whistle of the old 98 heading down to the New Orleans. But sometimes we encounter new information that leads us to realize that our knowledge, a base as it is currently constructed, is incorrect or outdated. We may respond in a number of ways. We may search for a new input from our senses, seeking either to reconstruct the knowledge base or develop different patterns and structures so that the information fits. In some instances, we may be so convinced of our knowledge base that we refuse to make allowances for the new information. Students follow the same patterns as they try to make sense of new information they encounter in school. Cognitive psychologists also suggest that we organize our knowledge in ways that allows us easy access to knowledge we use regularly. These cognitive structures, which are called schisms or schemata, change constantly as new information is taken in, hypotheses are developed, and theories are tested. These processes of hypothesis development and testing can be done independently or in interaction with others. Thus, real learning for constructivists involves moving from the trivial pursuit or jeopardy type of factual or declarative knowledge to applicable knowledge. In other words, from knowing what to knowing how. To achieve this transformation, learners must develop cognitive learning strategies for particular kinds of learning tasks. That is, they must learn how to think through or go about solving problems. One teacher describes how she puts her constructivist philosophy into action in the Voices from the Classroom feature. As I began my career in education, I held firm one belief about students: they must be active participants in the classroom. 12 years later, I hold that same basic belief but have refined what it means for a learner to be active. Early in my career, active meant that my students would not sit in rows and spend the day doing seat work. My first position as a kindergarten teacher quickly revealed that I might strive for something greater than physical activity. Of course, kindergarten students are active, trying to keep them from being anything but active. I came to recognize that although active bodies can be important, what I really wanted was to engage the minds of my students. As I taught students at many elementary levels, I learned to ask probing questions that required my students to consider their learning carefully. How do you know to add these two numbers? What kind of person do you think the main character of this story is? How would you explain why oil floats on water to someone who doesn't understand? Although my students were often physically active, acting out scenes from a novel we were reading, experimenting with magnets or prisms, or using pattern blocks to build models of math problems, they also spent time physically inert but inwardly engaged in active thought. Soon, however, I was not satisfied with simply engaging the minds of my students. I wanted to reach their hearts. I wanted to awaken a passion of learning within each student. How might a teacher encourage the awakening of such passion? One key, I think, is to allow and encourage the students to ask and seek the answers to their own questions. In this way, students' minds and hearts become active, leading them on a lifelong journey of inquiry and self-motivation. At this point, you may be a little confused and possibly discouraged by all this heavy vocabulary and lofty thought. To expect to be able to understand and evaluate critically every aspect of each philosophy is to expect of yourself what few professional philosophers are able to do. What you have just finished reading is a precise of some of the major ideas of Western civilization. Some of these ideas have been around for centuries, and some are the fruits of thinkers who are still with us. How can you use the summary table in Table 9.1 to help you develop your own philosophy of education? First, recognize that selecting philosophy by which you will live and by which you will guide your professional activities takes much more investment of time, thought, and energy than reading our short chapter. Second, realize that you have already begun to uncover your philosophy of education. You started when you filled out the Philosophy of Education self-inventory. You can further your self-understanding by following the suggestions in the Up Close feature entitled Identifying Your Own Philosophical Learnings. Third, realize that developing and refining one's philosophy of education is a lifelong endeavor, and commit yourself to making this journey. Think of your favorite teacher from elementary or secondary school, or a teacher you have admired during your teaching education. On a separate piece of paper, list some of that teacher's practices that you admire most. Include instructional techniques, classroom management strategies, ways of relating to the students, anything you think helped that person be an effective teacher. Now, on the same piece of paper, write the philosophical outlook that you think may underline each practice you admire. This exercise will take some reflection, and you may well find that no single philosophy matches all the teaching characteristics you listed. Use whatever philosophical labels seem most appropriate. After completing both tasks, what general conclusions can you draw about the philosophy of this teacher you admire? Does the teacher practice reflect the tenets of a single educational philosophy discussed in the chapter, or does he or she take an eclectic approach eclectic approach, drawing on different philosophical traditions? Are there ways in which this teacher is too unique to fit any category? As a final step, reflect on what your conclusion tells you about your own philosophical learnings. If you hold this teacher in high regard, presumably you share at least some of his or her philosophical convictions. Does anything surprise you about the philosophical beliefs you have deduced? Do they suggest that you are more traditional or more progressive than you supposed? More child-centered or subject matter-centered? More nicely balanced or just more muddled? Which aspect of your own philosophical base do you need to think about further and clarify? Some teachers, like the teacher philosophers discussed in this chapter, settle on more philosophical view, and that view then serves to structure all of their work. Other teachers lean strongly toward a particular philosophy, even if they may or not be fully conscious of their position or able to give it a proper philosophical label. Typically, they have a particular view of learners, including how learners should be approached and what is most worth knowing. Of course, few teachers are philosophical purists. Some teachers, recognizing that they draw ideas from various philosophies, label themselves eclectics. But what does it really mean to be an eclectic teacher in contemporary education? Eclecticism embodies the idea that truth can be found anywhere, and therefore people should select from various doctrines, systems, and sources. Eclectic teachers select what they believe to the most attractive features of several philosophies. For example, a teacher might take from Romanticism the innate curiosity of learners, and from Essentialism a curricular viewpoint dominated by criterion of usefulness. Eclecticism is quite popular, but often for the wrong reasons. It sometimes appears as the easy way out of a philosophical uncertainty, just taking what you please from the philosophical criteria of ideas. One problem with this approach is the probability of inconsistency. To take one's view of society from the romantic, who gives primary to individual freedom, and one's teaching methodology from the progressive, who stresses group membership and democratic process, is liable to make anyone confused. Selecting eclecticism must not be an excuse for lazy thinking. Despite this warning, most teachers feel quite free and justified in borrowing teaching methodologies and strategies that are associated with various philosophies of education. An ardent perennialist teacher may choose to involve his or her 6th grade students in a hands-on project that involves constructing a large topographical map of Odysseus' 10-year journey to his home after the fall of Troy. Conversely, a free-spirited romantic teacher may insist that each student memorize and be able to recite 50 lines of the Odyssey. Although this type of eclecticism may, in a narrow sense, seem philosophically inconsistent, at its heart is a recognition that no philosophy of education is able to dictate the ideal methodology or learning strategies for all situations or all students trying to learn all subject matter. Related to this notion is the growing realization that different students possess a great range of learning styles, and that what works with one student may flop with another. In some, eclecticism may be a serious philosophical position, and eclecticism is the selection of teaching strategies is quite justified. But to reinforce our earlier statement, the choice to be eclectic should not be a substitute for sloppy thought. We are not suggesting that you sit yourself down with a cup of coffee, think through all these issues, and come up with a tight set of philosophical answers that will last the rest of your lifetime. Rather, we hope that we have focused or refocused your attention on some of life's most critical questions and on some issues that reside at the very core of teaching. One purpose of the general education component of teacher education programs is to provide a chance for future teachers to think through these fundamental questions of human nature and existence. A primary purpose of the college curriculum is to present students with a wide range of society's best thinkers and their attempts to understand their own existence. Of course, the infamous College Bowl sessions may be where the real philosophical inquiries occur. These debates are frequently thinly veiled discussions of what really counts in life and what one should try to do with one's life. In effect, then, both the formal apparatus of college and its curriculum and the informal opportunities to meet, talk, and test your ideas with a variety of people should help you discover where you stand on some of these essential human questions. End of chapter 9.